So in the last video on requirements engineering, we talk about the fourth activity, which is requirements management. So how do we manage, how do we keep track, how do we deal with our requirements once we have them, once they're validated, and we know they're complete. And important here is once again to consider that a lot of systems are long-living, the development is long-living, so it's not just like we write down requirements and forget them the next day, but we need to keep track of them. And one thing that is very important is that we have to deal with change. Things change, and we somehow need change management or a process of handling changes. This is of course also because we will get things wrong. Even if we do an excellent validation, there's a good chance that the things are not complete or not all correct, or so on. So somehow we need a process for handling changes. And this is something that, for example, Somerville spends a lot of time on in his book, on what's the process. For example, if the customer or an end user comes in and says something needs to be changed, how do you deal with that? First of all, how do you figure out whether this is a bug in the system, it's a requirement you missed, it's maybe a requirement that you misunderstood or the customer somehow expressed in the wrong way. And once you have figured that out, what changes do you need to make in your requirements? How do you update them? But also, if you already have implemented a system, how do you actually update the system then? How to make changes and how do you roll them out? So all of this ultimately has to do with requirements. The other thing in this context, and it relates to the change process, is that you might have to think about what's your policy for traceability. So what information do you want to keep that connects different requirements or requirements to other parts of your development? For instance, you might have a requirement and you might want to have a trace link, a connection that says where in the software is it implemented, which part of the code, which is something that has different dimensions. It has a tooling dimension. For instance, if your code is somewhere in VS Code and you have a requirements tool, how do you actually create this connection? Do you just manually have to, for example, write a comment in the code that says this is requirement 1, which is very hard to change or maintain, or do you have some kind of tooling that allows to do this automatically? This is also a lot of work, so you really have to think of which of these links do you need to keep. For example, a lot of regulations require tracing between requirements and tests that say, how are your requirements actually tested? Are all of them tested? And if a requirement changes, what do you need to update? As you can imagine, if you have connections, there can also be requirements to other requirements. This is very useful information. So it's something that you can use a lot when things change. If the requirement changes, you know exactly what code and what test to change. But it's very expensive to create this, and it's even more expensive to update this and keep this up to date. This also often becomes a question of who does it. For instance, depending on your development process, you might have a requirements engineer, a software developer, and a tester, 3 different people. If something changes, who makes the change in the trace? Who changes the documentation? So very useful stuff, but also very expensive. So that's the question that you need to decide what is really necessary. What some companies also do because of that, because it's so expensive, that they say we document our requirements as tests. So the tests are our requirement, and we can skip having these links between them, and we can skip writing 2 different things. Has other issues, but this is also an approach to deal with that. Another thing that is very important in requirements management is the tooling aspect. As I already said, it can be very problematic to have things in different tools, in different databases, and you need to connect them. So a lot of companies that we talk to, when we talk about requirements engineering, they immediately go to tooling. What's the right requirements tool? You know, what's the best option for us? What's most cost efficient or most powerful? And depending on how your process looks like, depending on how your traces look like, and so on, you might want to have different kinds of tools for that. So there is a lot of interest in this. This is very important to consider, because one of the things that is constantly happening in software development and in other parts really is change. Change happens all the time, and it's relatively easy to just develop a system from scratch, but the big question is always what happens when things change over time. This kind of summarizes the different activities in requirements engineering, but I also quickly want to summarize the overall idea on why it's relevant. So we've talked about that we need to find out, we need to discover what the requirements are, and we need to write them down, validate, and so on. But one important thing to consider in this context is that it's not really that we're that interested in just writing down the requirements. That's not what we care about, and in fact, with the agile processes, it also has changed a lot, and a lot of people have said, why do we need requirements? We don't want to document a lot, we just want to find out what we need and quickly implement it. So do we need requirements engineering at all? And the important thing to understand is that a lot of requirements engineering is not about writing a big document or a big specification. A lot of requirements engineering is about keeping track of your knowledge. So the understanding of what is it we are building, what have we built, why is it necessary, and maintaining that over time. Because a thing that is common in software engineering overall, regardless of the process, is that people change as well. So you might have a person that has a very good knowledge of how your system works and why, but then that person might leave. And especially if your system is developed over 10, 20 years, it's very important to keep this knowledge within the company of what is the system supposed to do, what happens if things change, and so on. And especially things like the rationales. Why did we decide to do something? And this is really the real value of keeping track of your requirements over time is the knowledge, is the understanding of what is it that we're building. So this is something that is also important in agile development, and the focus on just is it written down or not is not really relevant in this context. It's really all about knowledge. So this concludes the module on requirements engineering. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next module.